Welcome. I am Lynn Roper, President of the Mari Sandoz Board of Directors. And if you can see me, in my background is wonderful Western Nebraska, a painting I have in my home, as well as the statue of Mari Sandoz that we would be seeing if we were gathering in Chadron at the Chadron State College campus where the Mari Sandoz High Plains Heritage Center would be located. So this is as close as we can get to it today, but we appreciate you being here. You're joining us from coast to coast, actually 3 countries. Our UK people have signed in and said hello. We have over 190 registered for the 2-day program, and this is the second of our 2 days. As you are probably knowing, this is our first virtual Pilster Lecture and Sandoz Symposium. For over 30 years, the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society has hosted an annual conference at Chadron State College to discuss the books that Mari Sandoz wrote, to examine and learn more about the topics she wrote about, which were the Native Americans, the homesteaders, the ranchers, and the history of the Great Plains. Mari Sandoz was born in 1896 south of Hay Springs in northwestern Nebraska. As a child, she listened to stories and began writing short stories. Moving to Lincoln in 1919, Mari became a writer of novels and a historian of the plains. She vividly described the culture of Native Americans, their persecution, and near destruction. She also gave voice to the homestead experience and chronicled the people of the High Plains. She wrote more than 20 books and is particularly remembered for 2 biographies. Old Jewels, her first work about her immigrant Swiss father, who homesteaded in western Nebraska, and Crazy Horse, legendary leader of the Ogallala Sioux. Sandoz was a teacher and a writer, even reading book proofs while she was dying of cancer in the New York City hospital in 1966. She was the recipient of many accolades, and her bust stands in our state capitol rotunda for being named to the Nebraska Hall of Fame. The Mari Sandoz Heritage Society works to build an appreciation of her body of work and to preserve the legacy of this premier historian by bringing people together for the discussion of her works. Today, 50 years after our founding, we host an annual lecture and symposium. We support the Storycatcher Writers Workshop each summer. We offer an annual research award, the Sandoz Scholar, and we publish through the Sandoz series a set of writings with scholarly essays on her work. The Society maintains extensive archive materials, including her manuscripts, her research, her hand-drawn maps, copies of her voluminous correspondence, and personal items, all of which are housed at the Mari Sandoz High Plains Heritage Center in Chadron. Please join in supporting this work by becoming a member of the Sandoz Society. You can go to the same website, marisandoz.org, that you used to register for this program. Your membership is vital in helping the Sandoz Society continue to maintain the legacy of Mari Sandoz. This program is brought to you in cooperation with Humanities Nebraska, a statewide nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching personal and public life by offering opportunities to thoroughly engage with history and culture, with additional funding by the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. We also want to thank Southeast Community College in Lincoln for the technical support of our webinar today. We usually have a book display and sale at our meetings, but today we are doing a virtual book exhibit thanks to the University of Nebraska Press. So there will be a virtual book exhibit from the University of Nebraska Press during our program. Now I'm happy to introduce Dr. Jillian Wenberg, a member of the Sandoz Society Board of Directors, who will present the award for this year's Sandoz Scholar. Jillian?
Hello, good evening, and welcome to everyone here at the Mari Sandoz Virtual Symposium. I'm so glad to see so many participants, both last night and tonight. It means so much to all of the board members. We've been aflutter on email all day today, so excited. I'm here tonight representing the Mari Sandoz Research Award Committee, which is comprised of 3 of our board members, Dr. Holly Boomer, Dr. Renee Lagred, and myself, Dr. Jillian Wenberg. The Mari Sandoz Heritage Society encourages research on Mari Sandoz and her work by offering an annual research award of $1,000 for proposals that emphasize new insights into Sandoz or new approaches to her life and work. The award recipient then presents this research at the annual Mari Sandoz Symposium, which you are at right now. Applicants that are interested in applying for next year's research award, here's my plug. If you know anyone interested, are welcome to access our website, the marisandoz.org site. You can also find my email there. So if you have any questions at all, please let me know. There's additional financial assistance to all these award winners in name of the Voorhees Endowment. If you're interested and you get that one award, you can also apply for that other funding to access the archives. And now our unveiling of this year's award winner, which we are very fortunate because he's actually on your screen right now and we'll have the chance to hear him speak a little later. I'd like to announce that the Sandoz Research Award Committee is pleased to have Brock Anderson as the 2020-2021 Sandoz Scholar. Mr. Anderson is currently enrolled in the UNK History Graduate Program with plans to defend his thesis by next summer. He is currently the Community Engagement Director at Trails and Rails Museum. Mr. Anderson's stated research questions involved examining how the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 influenced future interracial interactions in the Sheridan and Dawes County communities. He will also examine the early 20th century interracial relationships in these Nebraska border towns. Anderson plans to utilize primary resources from the Nebraska State Historical Society, Sheridan County Courthouse, Sheridan County Historical Society, and Mari Sandoz Heritage High Plains Center. He will also be examining the archives from the Coffey and John Green files at the Sandoz Center. Anderson will present this research next fall, where I hope to see all of you. And just a quick plug for any UNK students that are out there, I'm also a former LOPER. I had no doubt that the history program, Dr. Chris Steinke, who is on Brock's committee, influenced such great research to see all that primary source material, which the Sandoz Center has an abundance of if you're interested. Congratulations to Mr. Anderson, and thank you to all of the applicants for this year's consideration. The committee had a very difficult decision to make this year. And now I'd like to introduce Michael J. Smith, our moderator for this evening. Smith served as Director, CEO of the Nebraska State Historical Society, now History Nebraska, from 2006 until his retirement in 2016. Smith's prolific 44-year career in history and museums included executive leadership positions in both Midwestern and Eastern institutions. He and his wife, Mary, reside in Lincoln, where he retains an interest in the humanities and public life. And he also serves on the Mari Sandoz Heritage Board. We are lucky to have him serving as our moderator for this evening's event with so many of our great speakers. So I'll turn it over to Michael now.
Thank you, Jillian. Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you out there. I sort of feel like the old Navy signal that you sent out early in the 20th century. Message to all stations on shore and all ships at sea, since we have people from so far around the world. It's a great day to have you here on day 2 of our Sandoz virtual lecture and symposium. I hope most of you were able to join us yesterday for yesterday's excellent Pilster lecture and discussion. That session illustrated, I think you will agree, just why the story of a Mexican migration and Mexican contribution to our American society is essential for us all. Be sure you revisit the session using the instructions that will be on the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society website. The subject of ethnicity and immigration continues with us today. The place that we will focus on is Western Nebraska, where a number of immigrants from Europe, Mexico, Asia, and beyond came to settle in what had been Indian country. Before getting into the subject, I want to let all of our participant viewers know that you will be muted during the presentation. But you are nevertheless encouraged to submit questions or comments using the chat feature on your screen. And I notice we have a number of people who have already done that. We hope to have time at the end of the session to take up some of those questions. So We are delighted today, I am delighted today especially, to be joined by four individuals who have both deep knowledge and interesting personal points of view on this subject. And when I say your name, if you hear me, please just raise your hand or nod. Brock Anderson, Marty Ramirez, Becky Thomas, and Vicki Shapler. You'll meet them in just a moment. I'm going to introduce each of them as their time to present comes up. I think it's easier for you to remember a little bit about their background if they're immediately presenting. Before turning to our panelists, however, I want to provide at least a few words of background regarding the place that is the setting of today's symposium. Well, our audience, we call it Sandoz country. Well, our audience today includes those who were born, raised, and have lived their whole lives in Western Nebraska, in the Panhandle counties and the unique Nebraska Sandhills. We are joined certainly by many who are learning for the first time about this part of Nebraska. Therefore, a few words of introduction to the place and its history is in order. I'm going to try to share the screen here. If you can see the map of Nebraska that I put up, area we're talking about are those Panhandle counties out there in the far west of Nebraska. Western Nebraska is situated on the Great Plains, specifically on the High Plains, that vast, arid, generally flat, and treeless area stretching from Western Canada's provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan all the way south into Texas. The Great Plains were formed by the erosion of the Rocky Mountains, rock and soil that was spread eastward by rivers and wind over millions of years, thereby filling ancient seas and the environments that were once the home to the dinosaurs. Well, within the boundaries of Western Nebraska lie the celebrated Sandhills, where Mari Sandoz was born, raised, and which stand at the core of her writing. Talking about the Nebraska Sandhills, comprise about 19,000 square miles, or about a quarter of the state of Nebraska, the largest grass-stabilized sand dune expanse in the Western Hemisphere. But an expanse of sandhills that is interspersed with wet meadows and lakes, providing water. In fact, it's a grazer's paradise. Early European travelers also commented that the rolling landscape reminded them of seeing the waves of the ocean. Sandhills' rich prairie grasses and an abundance of water contained therein make the area a grazer's paradise, as I mentioned. Some 13,000 or more years ago, the earliest people to occupy North America entered what is now Western Nebraska while hunting the mammoth and the other large animals of the time. Over the ages, those animals disappeared and the modern bison, elk, mule deer, and pronghorn evolved, which provided food sources for successive peoples whose left behind stone tools record their one-time presence in the region. In late prehistoric times, about 1,000 years ago, the Apache lived here. During the course of their slow migration from the subarctic regions of the north to the southwest where we know them today. And the Comanches roamed here after moving from the mountains onto the plains. But in the late 18th and 19th centuries, Western Nebraska was the land of the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, peoples of the horse and the bison, whose stories Mari Sandoz collected and shared in her books. Cattle were trailed up from Texas and soon replaced the bison, finding ideal pasturage in the Sandhills. And farmers arrived, men like Jules Sandoz, Mari's father, known as Old Jules, who filed 160-acre claims under the Homestead Act of 1862 and planted wheat and corn and even orchards, despite the haphazard occurrence of rain in the windy, dry climate. Railroads arrived and civil society formed in towns and across the farms and ranches. Along the Nebraska-Wyoming border, farmers introduced crops, the sugar beet for one, and they developed irrigation systems, drawing water from the North Platte River. In the 20th century, center pivot irrigation expanded the cultivated acreage. And so in this area of Western Nebraska that we're looking at today, we found cattleman, sheep herder, shopkeeper, locomotive engineer, doctor, truck farmer, railroad track gangman, teacher, postmistress, wife, husband, children, all becoming part of the Western Nebraska community. Now, to hear some of the important stories of these people, we're going to turn to our panelists. And the first up will be Brock Anderson, who was introduced briefly by Jillian just a few minutes ago. And Brock, congratulations on a research award. Delighted to see that. As Jillian mentioned, Brock is Community Education Director for the Trails and Rails Museum in Kearney, Nebraska. He's an Alliance native and a graduate of Chadron State College, and now an MA student at UNK. He's researching the borderland history of Northwest Nebraska counties, including the adjacent Pine Ridge of the Ogallala, Pine Ridge Reservation of the Ogallala Lakota. Brock, can you take it away?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, Mike. I'm honored to be, excuse me, I got a frog in my throat. I'm honored to be the Mari Sandoz Scholar for 2020-21. And so I've got a couple maps here as well to kind of help some of our individuals that are not necessarily completely familiar with Western Nebraska. So, and I'm timing myself so that way I don't take up too much of your time. But when we're talking about Western Nebraska and kind of some of my research that I'm doing at this point for my thesis deals with Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and then really Dawes and Sheridan County. And so kind of, it's not the best map. I've got a better one coming up, but it shows a lot of kind of the dynamics and communities and how well traveled people really were. So this was a map made by Mari Sandoz about historical sites in the old Jules country. So, and this is from the History Nebraska Museum. And then also, when people are moving out this way, it's important to talk about railroads. I'm from Trails and Rails Museum here in Kearney, so I better be talking about some of what the railroads do and contribute to people moving out west. People were already living out here. We're going to see some examples of that with the Scammahorn Party or like Fort Robinson and some of these other places that had people here, but accelerates with the trains coming out west. So prior to settlement, a lot of Native American and non-Native relations is dictated by U.S. federal government relations. So that some of the big things would be the Battle of Little Bighorn, Treaty at Fort Laramie, killing a crazy horse, and then the one thing that really sets it all kind of for these interracial relations and what my research talks about is the Wounded Knee Massacre. And so that is the preface for how these local relations are going to go, and specifically these Nebraska border towns. And so a couple works that are really critical about where I'm going with my research deals with Jeffrey Ostler and Heather Cox Richardson in their work. So the Plains Sioux and the U.S. colonialism from Lewis and Clark, and then the Lakota and the Black Hills. Two great reads that really describe a lot of this tension that's starting up between the federal government and the Lakota specifically. And then Heather Cox Richardson, she takes this other approach, looking from the east and how party politics greatly contributed to the Wounded Knee Massacre. But what many people don't necessarily talk about is the fact that, okay, between the two Wounded Knees, we have a lot going on between the locals and the natives coming down from the reservation itself. And Wounded Knee, the Wounded Knee Massacre, being kind of one of those main prefaces. So I won't talk about a whole lot of that today into the early 20th century. I'm going to be talking more about the immigrants coming in the first half of my research. So a couple examples of the military being here that sets the motion of kind of how these relationships are going to go. Starts from like Fort Robinson and Camp Sheridan. And so on that far left side there, we have K Troop of the 9th Cavalry and all Black cavalry. And most of the soldiers at Fort Robinson are going to be African American. And so you can see there that there's a picture in front of a teepee, and they're in front of on Pine Ridge Agency or around that area. And then lastly, Camp Sheridan, which is very, very close to Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and constantly monitoring the activities of the Lakota, but also the locals in the area. Technically illegal for a lot of these people to go up north like they were, especially when it came to the Black Hills Gold Rush. We had the Gordon Party that's ultimately going to be named after him for Gordon, Nebraska. That's going to be turned away before an incident happens there. And so another map that I'd like to share with you comes from the Sheridan County Historical Society. And so we have these government interactions here in Nebraska, where the government's putting its foot into these borderland territories, and it's constantly changing how these areas look. And so one of the last ways that the government kind of influences this area with it in terms of borders is the White Clay Extension, and that eventually goes away under Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s. So there's some more investigation to do there to kind of give a brief background behind some of that information. Okay, and so kind of the heart of what I want to talk about today is the settlement of these communities in these border towns. And so you can see that on the far east side would be Valentine. On the far west, you would see Chadron and Crawford and a bunch of other little communities in between. I've primarily focused on the larger communities, such as Rushville, Gordon, Hastings, and Chadron, so that way, because they're going to be more of an important center for a lot of these businesses and violence when they erupt. And so I might have to even move, let's see here if I can move. Oh yeah, perfect. The screen there. So the railroad's going to be key for influx of a lot of settlers. And so we have Valentine by 1884, a lot of these settlers, they're going to have to jump off the train and go on a wagon to these places like Gordon or Rushville before the railroad comes through by 1885. And by 1885, all these towns are incorporated. Doesn't mean there's not a settlement there already. We'll talk about that with the Scammahorns and whatnot. And so, speaking of Mr. Scammahorn, he arrived to present-day Gordon, Nebraska in the spring of 1884. He's going to bring over 100 people from Indiana. He's a Methodist preacher, and so he doesn't have a hard time gathering people around him to come to a place where they need to just build from the ground up. He was really key into the incorporation by November of 1885, and by that time, there was over or near 500 people at that with that. So just goes to show, prior to the railroad coming out, there's still an influx of people coming in, but then once the railroad comes through, that's when a lot of the population starts coming out this way. So, and then going specifically to Dawes County, we have what's called the Sweat Colony. They're coming from northwest Missouri, called from Gentry County. There's about 20 some odd families, and they reach Valentine by 1884 and make their way to Sioux County before it becomes Dawes County and all these other counties. And many of the families there, they're going to contribute to the Chadron community as a whole. And so he's got a great mustache. I did just shave mine off, so I'm hoping to maybe build that up to that moment in time. I had to shave it because coronavirus and then the soot from all the air, smoke from the air. But great picture of Levi Sweat. He was also, I should say, he was a very practiced lawyer in the region, and he was very well to do with some of the banks as well. This is an interesting photograph because it's a picture of Fairview School District in 1911. And so when we talk about these people that are moving to Nebraska, you think of mainly just a bunch of white people or Caucasians. Not necessarily the case. We had just talked about the 9th Cavalry that was at Fort Robinson. A lot of actually African Americans were there. And so they don't necessarily just leave when they're done, they stay. And so by 1890, there was reported over 400 African Americans in Dawes County alone. So that's pretty tremendous to think that these individuals stuck around after their service at Fort Robinson, but ultimately they're shooed away because of some social anxiety, social links from many of the locals as well. But enough for a school for specifically for African American kids. Nebraska immigrants and where they're coming from. And so why are they coming? Like many individuals, they are coming for economic reasons, for land, for opportunity. That's exactly why Mr. Scamahorn is coming this way. He's got a whole group of people that they're going to take up some homesteads, they're going to take up some land, and it's a whole new community that he's in charge of. But there's also that social element as well. Nebraska is a safe haven. So in the below descriptions, I have the Volga Germans. They are fleeing prosecution from Alexander II because he had instituted a new oppressive laws that were taken back from Catherine that ultimately made them as peasants, if you will. And so they see the United States as a refuge and also some additional opportunities for them to progress in their culture and their heritage. Whereas in the Scandinavians, they're on the more the economic side. They feel like the free land, the romanticized views of America, they speak to them. And then, of course, we have the Union Pacific and all these other railroads trying to sell train tickets. So they're trying to get them out here just to buy a train ticket, so that way they can stay in business and continue to get that revenue. And then we kind of talk about some of what my main research part is, the native and non-native. And so that's why I use the non-native term, because it's not just white individuals living out here. There are African-American males. There are people from Scandinavia. There are people that are these Volga Germans, and they interact with native people very, very differently. But there's also this idea and this theme around what these native people are, that they are below them or they're part of the land in many aspects. And so this Wounded Knee massacre is going to be kind of one of these main ideas that are perpetuated on both sides of the border. So the common views of the massacre, there are going to be a lot of Lakota leaders that are going to perpetuate that among the natives, that this was something that's going to be remembered, and it's something that should be brought up and remembered occasionally. While as many of the non-natives, they're going to remember this as an uprising or as a battle. And as we know, it's not a battle today. And so that's still perpetuated in a lot of these Nebraska borderland communities. And so from this one event, we have all of these memories and fears and animosities and angst that accumulate into violence in the 20th century. And it's going to lead to much more violence. And that's why we get this other Wounded Knee in the 1970s. And it's not just this one Raymond Yellow Thunder that's going to be killed in the 1970s. It's not going to be just Dennis Banks that's going to be taking Wounded Knee up there. It's this accumulation of all of these events that lead to these moments.
Brock, you've got about a minute.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Am I over on mic?
No, go ahead.
Okay. And so, like I had mentioned, this is very emphasized on historical memory on both ends. So I'm taking a look at the centennials from Hay Springs, Dawes County, Gordon, that have some records of what they thought of what was going on with Wounded Knee. But also there is that side where the Ogallala, they have their own recollections and understandings of the past. I know John Neihart's book is heavily criticized for being a lot of his language, but Black Elk Speaks is another example of how he remembered that event. And so lastly, how does a borderland history contribute to our understanding of these events? Well, it builds off of Maury Sandoz's work. It's a bottom-up approach compared to many of the other works on the Lakota and Western Nebraska, which would be a top-down. And then it analyzes the space and environment as a contributing factor as well. It's not necessarily these players that are always contributing to this violence. It's the field that they were set up in with the military head setting that up. But also, I'm looking at both sides. So it's inclusive to the Native American side, but it's not strictly looking at the Lakota side. But it's also looking with the Western, the pioneers coming out this way, trying to understand more collectively what's going on. So with that, thank you very much for my presentation. And if you have
Thank you,
any
Brock.
questions,
That was very interesting, and we look forward to much more of that. We turn now to Marty Ramirez. Dr. Ramirez is a native of Scottsbluff, Nebraska, took his bachelor's degree at Chadron State College, MA and PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and served for 38 years as a counseling psychologist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's also a Vietnam veteran where he earned a Purple Heart, and I got to know him when we were serving, working on the Nebraska Sesquicentennial. Marty?
Good evening, and thank you. A special thanks to the Marie Sandoz Society for allowing me to present on a topic of Mexican immigration and migration to Western Nebraska that has been, for the most part, invisible and ignored in the annals of Nebraska history. This topic will be looked at from a broad perspective. My name is Mauricio Martin Ramirez. I am the last of 11 children and son of Mexican immigrants. I was born in 1945 in Scottsbluff. My grandfather Mauricio and his family arrived in Scottsbluff to work in the beet fields in 1927. And later my father and his family arrived in the early 1940s. One of the beliefs of the Punjabi tribe states that you will never know who I am until you know who my grandparents and ancestors were. One must take note that no other European culture has been in this country longer than the Hispanics. Spaniards and their descendants were already in the southwest and southeast by the late 16th century, later moving to the Great Plains. My father's real name is Tiburcio Gonzalez, who was born in 1897 in Tayahua, Zacatecas, Mexico. At the age of 15, he was drafted by the Mexican government to fight in the Mexican Revolution of 1910. He soon realized that he was fighting on the wrong side and joined the revolutionary forces of Pancho Villa. He was captured and was scheduled to be executed shortly. Like in the cowboy movies, he conned the court to let him and a friend escape. He set out north without any sense of where he was going. Along the way, he was separated with his friend. It took my father, at age 15, 2 months to cross the Sierra Madres by himself. It blows my mind. And he set foot in the United States, immediately looking for work at a rail yard. They called out the name Jose Ramirez. When there was no response, my father raised his hand and said, "Soy yo, I am him." My mother and her family paid 1 penny to cross the border in 1910 at El Paso. 3 sources of how Mexicans came to settle in Nebraska merit mention. 2 books, Broken Hooves and Plains People in 1976, a chapter, Chicanos, the Mestizo Heritage by Dr. Ralph Grajeda. Second, the book Elvira in 2017, a Mexican immigrant woman by Dr. Eduardo Hernandez Chavez, her son, and an article by Dr. Roger Davis in the spring of 2001, Latinos Along the Platte, the Hispanic Experience in Central Nebraska. With the exception of Native Americans and Mexicans in the Southwest and California, everyone in the U.S. has an immigrant history. History nurtures the foundation of personal identity. It enables one to discover their own in the stories of their families and community. They are stories of freedom, inequality, the struggles of injustice, racism, achievement, courage, and triumph. In 1845, equality of manifest destiny was now a major part of American life. This was widely held American imperialistic cultural belief that American settlers were destined to expand across North America, with the notion of imposing their cultural beliefs and a strong superiority mindset over the native and indigenous inhabitants and the Mexicans. The melting pot notion, a metaphor, starting in 1908 by Israel Zangwill in New York City. The idea was to abandon your cultural ways and become assimilated into the American way. Tonight, I will share the history of the arrival and experience of Mexican and Mexican Americans in the Scottsbluff area. I first became aware of how immigrants came to Nebraska through two articles by Mary Garbotz, who in 2000 interviewed Robert Manley, a Nebraska historian. He was asked the question, so why did you all come to Nebraska? And his response was, because we wanted them. And so they came from England, North European, and the Scandinavian area in the mid-1800s, and later from Southern European countries. It was an organized economic business, not by chance, conducted by the railroad and sugar industry agents. Their need was wanting blocks of people and families to toil in the agricultural fields and farms in Nebraska. Through recruitment efforts, family letters, word of mouth, they came with the hopes and promises of purchasing land through the Homestead Act and the right to vote and citizenship. They marginalized them as newcomers and challenged their homestead claim, or questioned their loyalty and religion. The sugar beet industry was becoming a major economic force in the U.S., making its way into communities in central and western Nebraska. By 1932, Nebraska was the largest producer of sugar beet in the nation. Scottsbluff became the top sugar beet producing county in Nebraska. The industry, as part of the recruitment efforts to the German Russians, prompted cheap tracts of land near the fields and bonuses in advance to pay for transportation, tools, and supplies. Homes were built for these prospective tenants, offered technical advice on planting and cultivation, and gave advanced long-term loans to secure tenants' land and homes. This offer was never offered to the Mexican beet worker. Melanie in his interview quoted a good friend saying, "These Mexicans think that they can do this without going through it." Melanie responded, "Well, what makes you think they are going through it?" The friend said, "We will make sure that they never get land out here, including farmland," which turned out to be very true and continues today to some degree. The German Russians were the first to heed the calling going to Scottsbluff during the summer and returning back to their hometowns in Eastern Europe. The Japanese were also recruited in making their presence in the Scottsbluff area. While some Japanese were able to buy farmland, a growing anti-Asian sentiment in the country was mounting, thus cutting Japanese immigration and prohibiting landowners, inducing many to leave. 1907 saw the cutoff of Japanese immigration to the U.S., and the outbreak of World War II in 1914 stopped the German-Russian immigration. The sugar beet industry now had to look for replacements. It now turned to Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and later Braceros from Mexico to build their workforce. The Bracero program allowed into the U.S. seasonal workers from Mexico from 1942 to 1964. The Mexican Revolution in 1910 was the initial catalyst that prompted the first wave of Mexican immigrants to come to Nebraska and Scottsbluff. Many came through Kansas City, and following the migrant stream from Texas, Arizona, Colorado. Others found their way from Wyoming and Montana. Upon their arrival, they found their way to the communities of Geary, Mitchell, Lyman, Morrow, Minutair, Baird, McGrew, Malbida, and Scottsbluff. More than likely, these agents had families already assigned to farmers across the region. In addition, the railroad industry provided employment with section crews and labor gangs called Extracrant, which my father was part of. He would work in the railroad for 9 months and be home for 3 months to work in the beet fields with his family. The railroad also provided a means of escaping the turmoil in Mexico. I started working in the fields from the ages of 9 to 18 after my freshman year in college. The sugar beet growing season began in late February and continued to late summer. Harvesting or topping the beets began in late September until November, outdoors in the freezing cold. The work was very demanding, working 9 to 10 hours in the summer heat with long and short hauls, which is very backbreaking. After the beets started in September, families worked in the potato fields in the region and in Gibbon in central Nebraska. which I went for 2 summers when I was 8 or 9 years old. As a result of working in the fields and topping beats, many students dropped out of school, and they would start late in school in November. If you can imagine that, going to school late every November. My family was fortunate, as all my siblings did graduate from high school. During the Depression, my father worked with educated white males and learned the value of education, living in small Kansas communities. The landscape of western Nebraska was now changing as the Mexican population was growing. Many never intended to stay permanently. Their families brought with them a strong work ethic, trying to protect their families from racism, oppression, and poverty. Housing for the new arrivals was located in the southeast part of Scottsbluff, near the sugar factory, the railroad, and the North Platte River. The big industry provided housing near the sugar factory in a colony housing section called La Colonia, the colony. There were about 20 housing units, which we call chantes, houses. The conditions were deplorable, as there was no electricity, running water, insulation, or no indoor toilets. Others lived on the farms with poor living conditions. Slowly, the Mexicans began to find their way into the barrio, about 1/2 mile west of the colony where I lived, that included the German Russians. The Mexicans called them Los Russians, Los Rusios. Many in the barrio lived in the barrio with similar housing conditions as the colony. Students went to a segregated school in the barrio. They soon realized that they were not in control of their environment, living conditions, or where they worked. The boundaries of language, ethnicity, culture, and class were clearly understood. It didn't take long to realize that their wanting of a better life was going to be a beat of a different drum. Hearing and confronting racism, injustice, and oppression, and stereotypes, and racial slurs such as greasers, spicks, dirty Mexicans, lazy Mexicans, was now part of the German-Russian community mindset. In the book, Elvira Hernandez talks about a KKK burning cross on top of the Scottsbluff Monument. Elvira's family arrived in Scottsbluff in 1920. An elected official stating over the way that Mexican people in his community were undesirables. I remember talking to Terry Carpenter, state senator from Scottsbluff, in the 70s. I asked him what he was doing for his Mexican constituents. He responded loudly, "I take care of my Mexicans," a sentiment ingrained by many in the community. For many, the racial prejudice and exploitation against them was intense, and some returned to their country scared and disillusioned. Joe Ramirez of Vermont stated that his father stated that if I'm going to be poor, I choose to be poor in Mexico. In the 1930s, as many as 400,000 Mexicans were deported back to Mexico under the Repatriation Act that included families from the Scottsbluff area. For those that stayed, they continued to work in the fields, in the railroad, and later working in the sweet meat pack company, construction, and other cheap labor jobs. As they began to establish this, their hopes and dreams of one day returning to Mexico and their hometown gradually dimmed. While their identity was not being defined by their migrant and cultural status, they had no intentions of giving up their Mexican cultural roots. In retrospect, as a psychologist, it would be fascinating to talk to these early workers, asking them about their mental health status, their stressors, their anxieties, their depressions, and how they coped with what was happening to them. Amidst the challenges facing body of life, a positive sense of being Mexican was filtered through the importance of the family, la familia. The family is a unified whole towards which one owes ultimate loyalty and we had fun. I had fun. There were fiestas celebrating September 16th, yesterday, Mexican Independence Day from Spain, with gritos, que viva la independencia, long live independence, que viva la raza, long live Mexican people, y que viva Mexico, with long speeches and dances. Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, a battle victory over the French. Religion was a mainstay in barrio life through its religious practices and celebrations. Our Lady of Guadalupe patron saint of Mexico. My baptism lasted forever. It was bigger than a wedding. The new immigrants and migrants came as members of the Catholic Church, Assembly of God, Baptist, and Seventh-day Adventists. Racism was immediately felt. Redlining practices in the banks, by the banks, relegated Mexicans to stay in the barrio. Signs were put on established which read, "No Mexicans, no Native Americans, and no dogs allowed." In 2 years, Mexicans had to sit in the back rows. In some Catholic churches, Mexicans were not allowed to sit next to whites. I remember me and my friend Oscar Barasa attended a Catholic Mass in Mitchell. Upon entering, we hesitated and saw that the whites were sitting on one side and the Mexicans on the other side. Years later, I ran into the priest who was presiding at the Mass and asked him about this. I asked, why would a Catholic priest allow this? His response was, that's just the way it was. St. Agnes Catholic Church in Scottsbluff would not allow Mexicans to become parishioners. As a result, the Catholic diocese built Catholic mission churches such as Our Lady of Guadalupe in Scottsbluff. Mexicans in the Maya were living without the resources that would ensure a healthy and secure lifestyle. Few streets were paved or had streetlights. Mexicans in the barrio were living without resources. City leaders felt that the barrio was kept marginalized, with less supported structures. Thus, political and civic engagement was kept in check. Many in the barrio resigned to this harsh reality and often felt that there was just no way out. Chicano actress Cesar Chavez stated that because we have suffered and we are not afraid to suffer in order to survive, we are ready to give up everything, even if our lives in our struggle for justice. Stephen Goyet stated that I expect to pass through this world but once. Any good thereafter that I can do, or any kindness that I show to any human being, let me do it now. Let me not defer nor neglect, for I shall not pass this way. In my heart and soul, I'm just a little brown boy from the bayou. Gracias and thank you.
Marty, thank you. Very inspiring. And follows up so well on what we saw yesterday and experienced yesterday in our Pilster lectures. Thank you very much. Moving along, we turn now to Becky Thomas. Becky is the director of the Night Museum and Sandoz Center in Alliance, Nebraska, a position she has held for 26 years. She is an Alliance native and an avid history buff. Becky was the key person, I think, in the $5.3 million renovation of the Night Museum and Heritage Center. Becky curated the new exhibits, wrote the text of the introductory film, and she's also the author of an Arcadia Alliance, a book on Alliance, Pictorial History of Alliance. She's also been a genealogist for over 30 years, and I think she's going to bring us today some of the results of those years of research. Becky?
Thanks, Mike. Well, I wondered when they called me what topic I could bring to this. And because I'm really more of a genealogist than a history researcher, but I realize that if you're not Native American, we all come from immigrants. So I thought it would be interesting to trace and understand the journey of some of these really sturdy and brave people. For some people, that's a daunting job because those people worked harder in one day than we probably work in a month. So it's an interesting story to follow along. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of the special groups to my area in Box Butte County, and that's the Bohemians. Now, keep in mind, I don't have a Czech bone in my body, so I'm going to butcher probably half of these names, but I'm going to try. So I'm going to start with a little background on their homeland, often referred to as either Bohemia, Moravia, or Czechoslovakia. Bohemia was the first Protestant country in Europe and the first to fight for democracy. And I understand the Bible was translated into Czech before it was translated into English. And this is all according to Rose Rozicki in her 1929 book, History of Czechs in Nebraska, which I found to be entertaining, interesting, and a really valuable resource for family history. She also states that Bohemians are Czechs and Moravians are practically Czechs. Now, don't laugh because that's a question we get asked all the time. Are they the same group? Well, she says they are, so we're going with her. They all started out as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but like most countries in Europe, the boundaries have changed many times over the years due to war and conflict. The country of Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic as we know it now, really didn't even exist before 1918. So that puts a whole new spin on when they call themselves Czechs. The first documented Czech settler that came to Nebraska was 30-year-old Joseph Frankel, who came in 1854 on his way to the California gold mines. He stopped in the Nebraska Territory, which was made up of what would later become the states of Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. Now, Joseph wasn't your typical immigrant, as his well-to-do father owned a glass factory and a brewery in County Koslov, Bohemia. And Joseph himself had studied music at the Prague Conservatory. Not your typical farmer coming through. He later performed and directed an orchestra in many concert tours through Bohemia, Austria, and Germany. He and his wife, Antonia Prokaska, whom he met in Wisconsin on his travels across the country, actually never made it to California. They stopped and ended up with a good farm life in fertile Nebraska. He died in 1911 in Crete, Nebraska, where his family donated his diaries of his travels and adventures to the Czech Foundation. These papers provide a really interesting glimpse of his immigrant journey. An excerpt of his diary are available in the same 1929 History of Czechs in Nebraska by Rose Rosicki. Now, the first Czech settler in Box Butte County was, I had to work hard on this one, but it comes out to Alois Sivish. Luckily for me, he was known locally as Louis. So this was his second stop in his journey across the United States after Belle Plains, Iowa. He came to what would be Box Butte County in 1884. We weren't even a county till 1886. And he was soon followed by 11 families of Czechs who found their way from Bohemia and later Moravia to settle on the plains and in the sandhills of western Nebraska. I thought it was interesting that many of them were older family men, and they were disillusioned by the dominance of Germany, the military conscriptions, and the economic conditions in Bohemia. They were looking for larger land parcels, and they were very enthusiastic about the possibilities that our area could provide. And surprisingly, many were not what we would think of as peasants. They could afford to purchase land, which also appealed to them because they could also get the Homestead Act, the Kincaids, and timber claims. So they could amass quite an amount of land for a lot less than they could in Europe because it wasn't even available. By 1910, at least an eighth of the Czechs in the United States were living in Nebraska, and by 1920, over 400 Czechs lived in Box Butte County, the edges of Sheridan and Dawes County, out of the 15,000 that were living in Nebraska. Well, Louis Sivish is kind of I'm one of my favorite guys to talk about. He was born in 1858 in Bohemia and is credited with being the founder of the Czech colonies in Box Butte County. He first heard about Nebraska through many of the Czech newspapers and the government reports extolling the fantastic farmland available here in western Nebraska. He came out here first to check it out. He ended up spending the summer of 1884 traveling on foot over 100 miles to examine the soil, test the climate, and any other items or situations that would be helpful to farmers or settlers wanting to farm here. He wrote up all his findings, and he sent them to a variety of Czech newspapers where he received many inquiries, and he faithfully answered every one of them. Those Czech papers were the agricultural equivalent to the mail order bride papers. They were just matching up farmers and available land instead of men and women. Louis continued to write to those papers to, extol the virtues he found out here and promote the area, even after he moved here. He also went back to Bohemia several times to recruit more farmers. So that makes him kind of our Czech answer to the current tourism and economic development people we have, or as his compatriots here called him, the Czech one-man band. In fact, those newspapers are kind of funny because a local Czech gentleman still subscribed to several of them until his passing just 5 years ago, because if we needed something read in Czech, we always had to call him. Well, Louis and his bride, Rosa Elia, traveled to their new home in March of 1885, going west through Fort Valentine to a settlement 8 miles west or northwest of Hemmingford in Box Butte County. It was a very long and arduous wagon ride, and at one point during his travels, a group of Native Americans offered him 2 ponies for Rosalia. Gracefully, he turned them down, but it did kind of make them hurry a little bit on their trip, trying to get to their new home before they got followed, which the new home turned out to be a hole in the ground covered with a tent. Boy, that makes any woman's heart beat stronger. Wedded bliss. And I told you they were tougher then than obviously we are today, because I'm not sure many of us would be happy with that happy home to start off with. He took a homestead and he took a timber claim in April of 1885, and he continued to farm there until he retired in his very late life, where he retired to Chicago, Illinois with some of his children, where he died in 1916. He and his wife, Rosalia, her maiden name was Novak, had 6 daughters and 1 son. When that first group of settlers came following Alois here, most were from Litostrov, Moravia, and they included several of Louis Civish's brother, and the Jelinek, Urbanovsky, Popmissel, Liska, Plinansky, Peltz, Kavarik, and Prokoska families. And those were the first families. And other than the Kavariks, they all still have family here. When the railroad built the line to Hay Springs in Sheridan County in 1886, of course, travel to this area became much easier and much faster. The Czech settlement was soon joined by the Krejčis, the Verovkas, Lavacheks, Havorkas, Bartos, Sahas, Shimiks, Sabatkas, Pozvars, Zeitz, Duhan, Baum, Moravik, Rendel, Dvorak, Turek, Chitka, Wanik, Chodlek, Caper, Harian, Kulis, Kozel, Morava, Cermak, Studny, Yonda, Yursa, Havronik, Holub, Kriz, Kura, Sedlak, Novotny, Kula, Matuska, Prokop, Yukout, Nerud, Hernkal, Kressel, Placek, Strasik, Talemka, Nakuda, Stumpf, Marachek, Vitruba, Tuchek, different than Turek, Skala, and Kudelka families. And those all still have somebody here, which I find unbelievable. Most of these families came here by 1910, from 1886 to 1910, with a few more groups showing up after World War I. And I am also pronouncing those names as they pronounce them today, because when I got the list, they were definitely written a lot different, but this is how they are pronounced today. So Louis had a nephew, Stanley Civish, who kind of took after him a lot. They both continued to promote farming in Box Butte County even after Louis left, and they went clear into the next century. But they also continued to aid their Czech friends and neighbors by helping them learn English, helping them to buy land, helping to become naturalized citizens in their new homeland. If you look in the naturalization papers here in Box Butte County, a Civish name shows up as a witness in about 92% of those, if they were Czech to start with. The Czechs were very good about banding together to help each other during blizzards, droughts, hard times, but boy, did they like to celebrate too. That's one thing they're actually famous for. Most settled in and around the area of Lawn west of Hemmingford. It had a post office, a stage station just up the road, a school, a Catholic church called St. Wenceslas, and a Catholic cemetery that still gets used occasionally today. A smaller group of Czechs settled on the east side of Box Butte County on the Sheridan border. The interesting thing I found about that when I started asking questions is why? Why were these groups so separated in the county? And I realized after they told me that the west side were all Catholic and the east side were all Protestant. And they still got together for a lot of things, but that's where they determined to live with their own religious group. And west of Lawn, the Lawn settlement, 2 miles, is a national Bohemian cemetery that holds 12 graves belonging to the Yonda, Plinansky, Kudelka, Moravik, Pozvar, and Saha families. But it didn't matter what church they went to. The one thing they had in common was the ZCBJ Hall. Now that stands for, and I had to write it phonetically so I could even say it, Zapadny, Sesko, Raturska, and Jednota Hall. Or as the non-Czech people in the county called it, zebras, cows, bulls, and jackasses, or the Bohunk Hall. That's the only way anybody could remember it. But the Bohemians weren't offended because before it was over, that's what they called it also. It was a local social club for the Czech community that was also the home for their fraternal group, the Western Bohemian Brotherhood Lodge, number 298. And if anybody could help me find those records in eastern Nebraska, I would owe you my soul because I've been looking for them for 20 years. One of the main functions of this group was it was a life insurance lodge besides a social lodge. The land for the building was given by Frank Turek in the fall of 1926, and Stanley Sivish was the first president for a long number of years. They met the first Thursday of the month for an afternoon meeting, which was followed by a lunch, a band or music performance, maybe a Czech play, or maybe even a Czech movie for the entire family to enjoy. Many Saturday nights on other weekends saw lively polka dances with bands usually made up of a drum, an accordion, a fiddle, a piano, and a saxophone, providing a one-beat rhythm, either fast or slow, depending on, and that entertained huge crowds. And they said the floors and walls would vibrate as everyone stomped to the music. If you've ever been to a polka dance, you get where we're going with this. At midnight, a lunch was served in the basement, which I understand included the best kolaches in 10 counties. And dancing continued until the wee hours, until the band finished the night with Home Sweet Home, announcing the end, which is kind of funny because most of those nights ended the way my uncles told it, just before sunrise. So obviously the Nebraska Czechs loved what they found here in Nebraska, judging by the number of families that stayed for what is now 3 and 4 generations. And they brought their rich culture of education and music and made a permanent mark on this area. So I'm kind of guessing you could say Louis Sivish's dream of a better place was realized here in Box Butte County, not only for himself, but for the hundreds of other Czechs that followed him to our wide open spaces looking for a better life. That's kind of what I have, but I want to thank you for letting me share this important part of our ethnic area. And we're always happy to research these families. In our research area, we probably have a file on almost every family I have mentioned, and we catalog the 37 local cemeteries where we have a page for each person, including a picture of their stone if they have one, a copy of their obituary, and then we do an ancestry search. So that's all available here at the Knight Museum and Sandhill Center in our Heritage Room. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Becky. That was a wonderful, rich story. Very much appreciated. You roared through those names like a professional, believe me.
You know how many at them today.
Now I'd like to turn to Vicki Schapler. Vicki is currently coordinator of the Japanese Hall and History Project at the Legacy of the Plains Museum in Gary, Nebraska. She took her undergraduate and master's degrees from the University of Nebraska at Kearney, a career worker with individuals with disabilities and medical conditions, and served as a director and counselor at the State of Nebraska Division of Vocational Rehabilitation Services. She has served on the boards of History Nebraska, where it was my pleasure to work for her, and at the Buffalo County Historical Society. Vicki, please share your story with us, please.
Well, thank you. And it's been really interesting listening to the different stories that we had today. I am here to speak about the Japanese that were in the Scottsbluff area. I am originally from the Scottsbluff area, and it's been just a wonderful journey to be able to learn more about my own nationality and where my grandparents came from. This happens to be a picture of my grandparents when they came to the Scottsbluff area in 1921. And many of the Japanese were leaving Japan because they were moving from a feudal system to a system of industrialization. They were on very small farms. So in a lot of cases, it was hard for families to make a living. The average farm was only 5 acres large. So the Japanese actually benefited, though, from one of the first pieces of legislation that were directed at a nationality called the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Congress makes a decision to no longer allow the Chinese to immigrate to this country. And the Japanese end up becoming railroad workers. Oops, sorry. Okay, so this happens to be a picture of my grandfather. And my grandfather actually immigrated to this country in 1906. And he came directly to eastern Colorado or eastern Wyoming, we're not really sure, and began working for the Southern Pacific because they were replacements for many of the Chinese workers that had been there. He came actually more directly. Many of the families came through Hawaii and then came to the United States. We always laugh because we think he snuck in through Canada because the quotas had been met, but he did come directly into the central area. And he joined his brother and several relatives. So when I look back at this picture, it is mainly of the many relatives that also worked on his crew. But almost every family that I've talked to that are from Nebraska and eastern Colorado and eastern Wyoming, many of them had family that were working on the railroads. And that kind of what brought them to the area. Now, there was a piece of legislation that was passed in 1906. Well, the legislation actually passed in 1907, but 1906, San Francisco decided that they were going to start segregating the Asians and putting them into schools that were only Asians. And this caused great offense to the Japanese government, who felt that they sent good immigrants to the United States. And they end up causing a stir, and the US government gets involved, and they end up passing an agreement called the Gentlemen's Agreements, where Japan did agree to not allow any further laborers to come into this country. But then they ended up passing where only the children, the parents, and the brides or wives could come to this country. So that ended up bringing something called a phenomenon of the picture brides. And my grandmother and many of the other first generation, or what we call Issei generation, ended up being picture brides. And what that meant is you are married by picture. You go through a formal arrangement. This happens to be a picture of my grandfather. And then I cheated a little bit, and we have a picture of someone else because we don't have my grandmother's picture. But they would actually go through a ceremony and be married through pictures. And then they would be entered into the family registry. So my grandmother is entered into the family registry. She is now able to get a passport from the government of Japan. And this happens to be a picture of my grandparents. But they end up, she comes then to Seattle, and they do go through another formal ceremony and get married. Now, one of the things that happens is that Scottsbluff area is now beginning to see a lot of different families, those laborers, the men that were working there. First came the railroad workers, but Great Western Sugar then hired many Japanese, and there was something like 300 Japanese laborers working either in the fields, in the factories, and eventually they would become tenant farmers, but around them become a whole community of Japanese. So you will see restaurants. This happens to be the Eagle Cafe, and Marty and I got to have a little smile about it because the Eagle Cafe actually opened in 1912 and remained open until 1967. So it was a big, been there for many years. But there were also a lot of farmers. So they farmed, they had mercantile businesses. There was many restaurants, a billiard club, a billiard hall that were directed for some of the young men. But I always have to laugh at the picture of the cabbage farmers. And I heard someone Brock talked about the Germans from Russia. And my grandmother used to raise cabbages so that she could sell them to the Germans from Russia that were in the area because they made sauerkraut. So we talk a lot about how they were so interconnected, the immigrants for the area. Now, the farmer here is from North Platte. So North Platte was another area that had a lot of Japanese, partly because of the railroads. So again, now, one of the things that happened in 1906, they had the U.S. Naturalization Act that was directed at people who that no longer allowed Asians to be able to become naturalized citizens. And so they would end up determining, they actually appealed the decision that no longer allowed them to become American citizens. And they end up, the US Supreme Court finds against them. And 1922, so Japanese, Chinese, any of the Asians cannot become American citizens. In 1919, these anti-Asian interests come into Nebraska, and they introduce a piece of legislation that is really an anti-Japanese land bill, but it's an anti-alien land bill directed at those who cannot naturalize. And because of this bill, a man by the name of Hiram Kano is a farmer. He is actually brought to this country by Williams Jennings Bryan, who is a 3 times presidential candidate who actually ate at his family home. Hiram Kano is part of the royal family of Japan. And so at this Nebraska state constitution, and I have to tell this story, but a man by the name of the Reverend Thomas Osborne is representing Morrill and Scottsbluff counties, and he has many Japanese friends. And so we talk about the fact that this bill is killed, but Hiram Kano would form what was called the Japanese Americanization Society of Nebraska. And he would become a leader of almost 200 Japanese farms that are represented as a part of that organization. But then in 1921, an anti-alien land bill, again directed at the Japanese, is introduced to the Nebraska state legislature. And they brought together many supporters because they had been talking to people. They end up bringing many supporters together, and they try to fight this bill. And they said that there was much discussion, and it would end up passing, but they would get concessions. So in some states, they had actually passed bills where they could no longer even lease land in certain states, the Japanese or the Asians in the area. But in Nebraska, they were able to buy their homes in town. They were able to lease land for up to 5 years. But Hiram Kano would talk about his greatest consolation is the fact that the second generation, the Nisei, are finally becoming of age. Now, I have to share this picture because Hiram Kano then meets a man by the name of George Beecher, or the Bishop Beecher, who then finds out that he's a Christian. And he's got all of these Japanese many of them are Buddhist, that he wants to send a missionary to. So Hiram Kano would eventually agree to become a missionary in both North Platte, Scottsbluff, and Mitchell areas. And so he would move, and under his leadership, it is felt that 3 Japanese halls formed, one in North Platte, one in Scottsbluff, and one in Mitchell, Nebraska. And they would have Japanese schools. So it was like a social hall, like many of the other groups had social halls. But they would have Japanese school for the kids during the summers. They would have theater events. They would have silent movies. They would have just many different things that were available to the Japanese community. They had baseball teams that played other Japanese baseball teams in other areas. And they would also have judo clubs. So it was just an organization that really encouraged people. Now, this picture is of the Japanese Young People's Conference. That is about 190 people gathered from Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska, and they tell me some people from South Dakota snuck in. But this is what Father Kano's leadership brought to our community, because he really wanted young people to meet other Japanese Americans. And so this is what happened. Now, all of a sudden, Pearl Harbor happens. And Pearl Harbor is a horrible event for all Americans, but particularly for the Japanese and their children, because this is the home of their brothers, of their sisters, of their parents, and in some cases, their children. They are now cut off from their families. And leaders of the Japanese community are picked up, including my father, who was the treasurer of the Japanese Americanization Society of Scottsbluff, Nebraska. He is picked up, though he has always said that he was treated very well and eventually released. But Hiram Kano, because of his contacts with the Japanese government, now keep in mind, the Japanese could not become American citizens. And so Hiram Kano became kind of the reporter to the Japanese consulate in Chicago of what was happening to their people. The Japanese government kept track of them. And Hiram Kano would many times report what was happening. But he was also part of the royal family of Japan, and his father was a viscount. So he remains incarcerated for up to 2.5 years before he is eventually released. Now, in Nebraska, we have several heroes that we have to share, because Japanese Americans, just like all Americans, wanted to serve their country. Now, in Nebraska, it was hard because in some areas, they actually discharged Japanese Americans. But in Nebraska, the local recruiters didn't necessarily want to do, but the Air Corps got $2 a signature. So many of the Japanese ended up in the Air Corps. And Ben Kuroki is a very famous, he became a national hero when the average person flew 25 missions. He flew 58 missions on a bomber. And there's a whole story about his life. A PBS special called Most Honorable Son that tells about his story. So if you are interested, you can see that. But there is another person from Alliance, Nebraska, who was, no one would have known about his story if it was not for a person who hunted him down. Tad Nagaki was a member of the OSS. And that's the Office of Strategic Services, kind of that precursor to the CIA. And he ends up being dropped behind enemy lines with his crew. He provides interpreter services, interrogation, espionage, recruiting of the villagers in China. And he was instrumental in the liberation of a missionary prisoner of war camp. And this senator finds him. She was 9 years old and hunted him down and remembered his service. Otherwise, people in Alliance would have never known about his story. Also, in Nebraska, there are probably over 50 individuals that served from Western Nebraska. We don't know about the whole state, but particularly Western Nebraska. My father was a member of the Air Corps, but the Air Corps didn't know what to do with all these Japanese Americans that had joined them. Some of them were pulled out. Now, Ben Kuroki got to stay in, and I always think that he had a great commander that he let him stay in. But my father was sent to Fort Robinson, where he spent a year while they were trying to decide, along with other Japanese Americans, what to do. Eventually, they formed what's called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which will become the most decorated regimental combat team of its size and length of service in all of in all of U.S. military history. And to give you an example, is they went in, their most famous battle was the rescue of the Lost Battalion. And in that situation, they had been involved in fighting already. They were supposed to get a break, but then they're sent to rescue the Lost Battalion. They would save 211 Texans. And they said that during these times of fighting, they had something like 1,400 men. They would sustain almost 800 casualties. And so one person talked about their uncle who lived in North Platte, who his team went in with 136, and there were 7 left. So quite the different battles that were had. But this is all the decorations that they received. And the 100th Battalion, because they had lost so many, was a Hawaiian unit, and they actually combined and joined that group. Now, one of the things that happened during World War II that I have to talk about is Executive Order 9066, which ended up putting 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans into camps. And something like 62% of them are American citizens. And one of the things that I found was very touching, and I was so excited when they asked me to speak, was a letter that a UNL archivist shared with me from Eleanor Hinman, that Marie, and I see I spelled that wrong, sorry about that, Marie Sandoz, was written to Marie Sandoz. And Eleanor was a best friend to Marie Sandoz, and she writes this letter about the incarceration of the Japanese from her area in Washington. And the fact that after Pearl Harbor, there is a burning of the Buddhist school there. And then, but 6 months later, when they are sending the Japanese off in trains, how children, their teachers are being sent away, would bring bouquets of flowers and presents because of what had happened. And they were so sad to see them go. And so the letter is just touching and quite lengthy, but very interesting. Now, we don't have time to get into a lot, but one of the stories that I love is the fact that Father Flanagan at Boys Town would take over 200 people out of the camps and allow them to work at Boys Town. And he would help another 100 be able to find employment. So if they could find a place to go, they could come out of the camps. And the University of Nebraska would end up raising money for scholarships. And they took over 100 Nisei or second generation into UNL. So we love those stories too. But even our own Scottsbluff Junior College took students out of the camps. And a man by the name of John Okada is kind of known by some as the first Japanese American novelist. John Okada served in the military intelligence service, but he wrote a book about a no-no boy, or somebody who resisted the draft. Now, keep in mind, they are drafting people out of these camps and expecting them to serve in the army, and they choose not to, a very small percentage. Most of them were so angry about what happened that these guys would say no when all Americans should serve their country. And all they said was, you need to release our families from jail, and then you would be able to, or from the incarceration camps. So, and then this is probably, the war ends, and the highlight of my grandmother's life is the fact that in 1952, they passed what's called the Walter McCarran Act. And the Walter McCarran Act finally allows Asians to become American citizens. So my grandmother, this happens to be a picture of the groups from both Scottsbluff and North Platte. and they now become American citizens. So that's kind of the quick version of all I've known. But I thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to share our story and to tell a little bit more. But this is the highlight, is when they all became American citizens. So thank you.
Vicki, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing the story of the Sakurada family and the Japanese Americans in Western Nebraska. We did have one question, and that was, were there other communities of Japanese living in northwestern or western Nebraska? You talked about Scotts Bluff, obviously, and but were there others in that area?
I'm sorry, Mike, I was trying to get out of my screen. So can you repeat the question?
Let me repeat the question. The question came in and asking if there were other Japanese communities in western Nebraska beyond Scotts Bluff that you've spoken about.
Scotts Bluff was probably the primary one. So like in 1930, in Scotts Bluff County alone, there were 350 in the census in 1930. So that was probably the largest population, and that doesn't even count the surrounding areas. But North Platte was the other one. Otherwise, in North Platte, I can't remember the exact number, but that was probably a large population because of the railroads. And that's the reason that those three places formed. Now, in Omaha, they had some situations where there was a strike there, and the stockyards and the Japanese laborers were brought in. But when we looked at the census prior to World War II, there were only 40 Japanese in Omaha. And outside of that, after the war, though, because of Father Flanagan, there were over 100. So those are probably the primary communities.
Okay, very good. Are there any questions from the panelists to each other? I think these have been fascinating presentations. In my opening remarks, Marty, go ahead.
I'd like to add, as a result of the experience of the Mexican, as a psychologist, there was a term called ethnic self-hatred. Because of what the environment was telling the Mexicans, we grew up thinking that the reason you're poor and the reason you're lazy is because you're Mexican. And to this day, that has left a profound impact in our psyche.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I was going to say that, Vicki, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there are some things that happened. And what I like is the fact that our immigrant groups were so interconnected. But the fact that one of the sadnesses for me was the fact that because of the prejudice and some of the things that happened, I didn't even know about the camps and that going on. My parents never spoke about the war. They never taught us Japanese. So there was some loss of just who we were. And I moved to Kearney, Nebraska, which is in the middle of the state, from Scotts Bluff. And, Scotts Bluff is probably 25% minorities, either the Hispanic, Mexican-American population or Japanese or whatever. But I moved to Kearney, and we enter Kearney Junior High, and there's 2 Asians in our junior high, and it's my brother and I. And so it became culture shock for us. And I think because of that, I felt a sense of loss in who my own community was. And that's why I think keeping our history, gathering this history and learning about and the preservation project that I'm in to preserve this Japanese hall, that was a Japanese hall for 90 years in the Scotts Bluff area. And I think few people realize that.
Well, I think this is 4 panelists today have given us an excellent introduction even to various stories from the Western Nebraska, but the depth of knowledge and the commitment that you all have to the stories of your communities and your history is something that I hope is inspirational to all the viewers who have been on. I mentioned at the beginning that I thought the High Plains, once considered, is probably still considered flat, treeless, and arid. But there's no aridity in the stories of the people who came to settle in the High Plains and in Western Nebraska. And those stories have many, many levels, have gone on for generations. And I thank you on behalf of all the participants for sharing those with us today. It's been delightful to moderate this session. So I think in wrapping up, unless there are any other comments, wrapping up, we'll thank the Humanities Nebraska for their support. Of course, the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society for this presentation, our first effort into this type of using this technology and in sharing the history that we love and that we want to share. So, and it's sort of made possible, of course, by the support, as I mentioned, of Humanities Nebraska and the support, technical support of Southeast Community College. Most of all, by the willingness of our panelists to share that and by the enthusiasm of our virtual participants to participate with us. And as you'll see on your screen, you will all be receiving an email with a link to a survey about this program. Please help us complete the survey that passes good information back to Humanities Nebraska, but you'll also be receiving an email with information about how to access the recorded versions of last night's session and tonight's session. So those are not, this is not something that you have to add notes on. You'll be able to go back and revisit these excellent presentations. And I want to thank our panelists for your work, your long history of work in these areas. And once again, congratulate Brock on his grant, and we look forward to his future research and remind people of the resources that you have in these three people and their institutions for the history of our Western Nebraska and the ethnic and immigration history of our state. So if I've covered everything, and I hope I have, I would say thank you again for participating with us, and we look forward to future programs and next year's Pilster Lecture and Symposium, which we hope we'll be able to do in person. Thank you and good night.